Did the legendary Beach Boys, one of the most successful American rock and roll bands of all time, ever play on their own records? I'm Adam Marsland. I'm the host of Pet Squares, a geek's guide to the Beach Boys, a YouTube series where we break down in excruciating and sometimes irreverent detail what went on those records, who played on them, some of the backstory, some deep analysis. Now, when I do this show, I'm consulting some of the world's foremost experts on the Beach Boys, historians and sessionographers who've spent years poring over old musician unions logs and tapes of the sessions, reconstructing who played and who sang what on all those old and largely uncredited recordings. Now, in recent years, thanks to some great documentaries and studio recreations in films like the Brian Wilson biopic Love and Mercy, we've come to understand that many of the Beach Boys' backing tracks, and in fact, many of the instrumental tracks for some of our most beloved songs from the 60s were done by an elite group of LA session musicians that have retroactively come to be known as the Wrecking Crew. However, while these movies have done great work in shining light on the contributions of musicians like Hal Blaine, Don Randi, Carol Kaye, Ray Pullman, Tommy Tedesco, and many others, they've also given rise to the narrative that the Beach Boys themselves, most particularly drummer Dennis Wilson, did little instrumental work on their own recordings. Now, it's great to see the Wrecking Crew getting their propers because they made a massive contribution to rock and roll. But the narrative that the Beach Boys never played anything on the records has taken hold so much that when it's been challenged on Facebook and in other places, I've seen it devolve into some downright nasty name calling. Now look, I've worked with some of the Beach Boys, and I've also had the honor and privilege of working with some of the Wrecking Crew. Hell, my old bass player played Carol Kaye in Love and Mercy. I and the people I consult with on the show have nothing but respect for these folks, and their contributions to rock and roll and the Beach Boys music are massive. However, if you care about facts and you care about music history, you want to see the record dictated by facts and not narratives. So while it's great that the Wrecking Crew story is finally being told, there is another story to tell here. And that's the story of a bunch of teenagers that could barely play, blundered into success, but within 2 years, a bona fide musical genius had emerged, and the band was slogging it out in the studio, executing this musical genius's increasingly complicated visions on a series of hit singles that are beloved to this very day. That too would be an incredible story, if it were true. So is it true? Well, for those of you that don't want to sit through this whole video, the answer is in many cases, yes. The Beach Boys did very often perform on their own records, not just singing, but playing. Now, I'm a believer in facts, I'm a believer in accuracy, so I'll tell you right now, anytime someone says something on an internet video that challenges conventional wisdom, you should ask for details and you should ask for proof. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to go through all of the UK and US top 30 hits by the Beach Boys and determine which ones, to the extent that it's known, were played by the band and which ones were not. And it mostly is known thanks to the tireless work of researchers like Craig Slawinski and his team, who have spent, as I said, countless hours going through session documentation and listening to the original tapes of the recording sessions themselves. Just like on a regular episode of Pet Squares, I've consulted and verified this information with Craig, who is, among other things, the source for all of the musician credits for the Beach Boys on Wikipedia. So what I'm about to tell you, to the extent possible, is the most up-to-date and verified information known about who did what on Beach Boys sessions. So without any further ado, here are all of the Beach Boys' top 30 US and UK hits in chronological order, answering the question of whether all, some, or none of the Beach Boys played all, some, or none of the instruments on their tracks. Remember, when we say all of the band played on the record, we're usually disincluding lead singer Mike Love, who, except on rare occasions, did not play an instrument on stage or in the studio. It should be noted that on nearly all of the Beach Boys hits, all or nearly all of the members sang. This includes drummer Dennis Wilson, about whom many myths have circulated, including that he did not play or sing on most of the band's records. This is false. So let's start in with the band's first major hit in 1962, Surfin Safari. Did the band play on the track? Yes. The band on Surfin Safari was the then current lineup of Brian Wilson on bass, brothers Carl and Dennis on lead guitar and drums respectively, and rhythm guitarist David Marks. Next up, the band's first top 10 hit, 1963, Surfin USA. Partly. Same lineup as Surfin Safari, but drummer Dennis Wilson had broken his ankle, so he was replaced for this record by session drummer Frank DeVito. Incidentally, legendary bassist guitarist Carol Kay, who did indeed contribute substantially to later Beach Boys sessions, has claimed that she played guitar on the original Surfin USA. However, the session documentation does not back up this assertion. It's theorized that Miss Kay, who was one of the busiest session musicians in Los Angeles at the time, is remembering a later session on which she is documented to have played on a cover version of this song. Next up, the high-charting B-side of Surfin USA, Shut Down. The answer again is yes, and this song is a rarity because it features all 5 Beach Boys on the instrumental track, with lead singer Mike Love honking out its distinctive 2-note sax solo. Next up, Surfer Girl, and once again it is the band, and this time they are joined vocally by returning founding member Al Jardine, who would soon be subbing for leader Brian on stage and in the studio on bass guitar. Now what about the B-side, Little Deuce Coupe, which charted at number 15? At one time it was reported that Brian had agonized over replacing brother Dennis's drums with those of session drummer Hal Blaine. Not true. It's the band on this as well, including Dennis. Next up we have Be True to Your School, and while the original session tapes do not exist for the single version, the playing is quite similar to the album version, which is indeed the Beach Boys, albeit augmented for the first time on a single by outside musicians, notably on horns and percussion, plus some additional backing vocals from the female surf band The Honeys, which included Brian's girlfriend and soon-to-be wife Marilyn Ravel. Next up, In My Room, a classic, and it is once again the band, albeit with a little bit of in-family help, including Mike Love's sister Maureen on harp and possibly Brian Carl and Dennis's mom Audrey on the organ. Session drummer Hal Blaine, who would go on to play percussion and drums on many Beach Boys sessions, adds percussion as he would on many tracks during this era, but it's still Dennis on the drums. Fun, fun, fun. Once again, it is the entire band playing on the track with a little bit of help from selected members of the Wrecking Crew. It should be noted that this time Hal Blaine is on drums and Dennis Wilson is on percussion. I Get Around, the band's first #1 hit. Once again, it is the band with help from a couple of session musicians. This time it's Dennis on drums with Hal Blaine playing timbales and brushed snare. Don't Worry Baby, once again, this is the band and all the band, and this is an interesting situation because recently departed rhythm guitarist David Marks apparently, although this cannot be completely proven, did the song's minimal guitar solo during a session when the rest of the band was not available. So once again, we have 5 Beach Boys on the instrumental track with no outside help. When I Grow Up to Be a Man, perhaps Dennis Wilson's finest hour as a studio drummer, and it is indeed him, and the rest of the band forming the instrumental basis for this classic song, with help from only one session musician playing the harmonica. Dance, Dance, Dance is indeed the Beach Boys playing the instrumental track, and unusually in their live configuration with Brian Wilson and not Al Jardine on bass, and Al Jardine backing up Carl Wilson on guitar. It is Dennis on the drums, and once again the band is augmented by a few session musicians on 6-string bass, accordion, percussion, and horns. 1965's Do You Wanna Dance was the first and only Beach Boys hit single to feature drummer Dennis Wilson on lead vocals. It also marked the point where Brian Wilson started using the Wrecking Crew more often than he used his own band. But even though the Wrecking Crew did the bulk of the tracking on this song, we still have Brian on keyboards and Carl on lead guitar. Next up, Help Me Rhonda, and once again, it's the Wrecking Crew on the basic track, plus Carl and Brian on guitar and keys, respectively. California Girls, it's the Wrecking Crew, plus Carl stays in the mix on lead guitar. California Girls was also the vocal debut of newest member Bruce Johnston, a California music veteran who would also contribute to the band live and in the studio on keyboards and bass. As of the making of this video in 2022, Bruce Johnston is still an active touring member of the Beach Boys at age 80. Incidentally, before Bruce signed on, Glenn Campbell replaced Brian Wilson on the road. For the purposes of this tally, we're not including Glenn Campbell's numerous contributions to the Beach Boys records as a session player. The Little Girl I Once Knew is a historic moment for the Beach Boys, as it's the first single to feature Carl Wilson as part of the lead vocal tag team. Although up to this point, Carl had kept a low profile. Since Brian's retirement from the road earlier in the year, Carl was now leading the live band. And as time went on, Carl would assert himself in the studio and become the band's acknowledged vocal star. It's also significant that this is apparently the first Beach Boys hit single with no instrumental involvement from the band. On the other hand, the band's massive hit cover of the Regent's Barbara Ann that followed this was the band, possibly on their own, although there may have been a random tambourine shaken by somebody or other. At this point, we enter the Pet Sounds and Smile era, and this is where the myth that the band never played on their own records arose, as it's largely, although not completely true, during this time period. The first hit single from Pet Sounds, Sloop John B. No band instrumental involvement. As for the other singles on Pet Sounds, Wouldn't It Be Nice and the legendary God Only Knows, apparently there is no band instrumental involvement. That brings us to the band's watershed October 1966 single Good Vibrations, which evolved over a long and tedious series of evolutions and sessions. Although the Wrecking Crew musicians are responsible for about 99% of the instrumentation, Brian, Carl, and Dennis Wilson all have instrumental cameos on the finished product. Most notably, in his first appearance on a Beach Boys record on keyboards, Dennis Wilson provides the gospel organ in the song's breakdown. By contrast, Good Vibrations' legendary and protracted follow-up Heroes and Villains only features Beach Boys leader Brian Wilson on keyboards. Now, between the release of those two singles during the endless wait for the aborted Smile album, the Beach Boys toured England and Europe. In order to have something to sell during the tour, and against the band's wishes, the Beach Boys' British label released Then I Kissed Her, a cover of an old Crystals track which had been an album cut on their 1965 long player Summer Days and Summer Nights. It made the top 5, and this track does feature the Beach Boys, all of them except Mike, cutting the track in a unique instrumental configuration with Brian back on bass as well as percussion and piano, newbie Bruce Johnston covering organ, and Al, Carl, and Dennis reprising their onstage roles on guitar and drums. Except for a couple of percussionists, it's just them. Following the Smile debacle, the band regrouped in a garage band approach, and their follow-up single, Wild Honey, was a return to the band providing all of its own instrumentation. With the exception of the signature sound of Good Vibrations, the electro theremin making a return and once again being played by session man Paul Tanner. The more successful single from the Wild Honey album was Darlin, and this started out as a track for a band called Redwood, which later evolved into Three Dog Night. The instrumental tracking for Darlin was mostly done by session musicians, but again augmented by Brian and Carl Wilson. The Friends album was a major flop in the United States, but its lead single still did well in England. Friends largely features session musicians, but Carl Wilson does pitch in on guitar. The band's next big hit was Do It Again, and once again, this is the band, albeit augmented by a few session players, most notably drummer John Guerin, who is overdubbing to Dennis's original drum track on the demo. I Can Hear Music is significant for a number of reasons. This is the band on the track, and it includes Mike Love, unusually, on percussion, and more unusually, Brian Wilson does not take part in the instrumental tracking. This was Carl's first major production, and Carl appears on various instruments, including some of the drumming, but all of the band, minus Brian, pitches in one way or another, with the only outside musician being touring band member Mike Kowalski on sleigh bell. With Brian not participating vocally or instrumentally, this is the point where his withdrawal from the band becomes critical. Despite that, nearly all of the Beach Boys' top 30 hits have Brian Wilson in some capacity. The only other instances of a Brian-less Beach Boys' top 30 hit would be the #1 hit Kokomo in 1988 and most likely Al Jardine's 1979 British hit Lady Lynda. The Beach Boys' swan song for Capitol Records was the 1969 single Breakaway, co-written as a purpose-made hit by Brian Wilson and his dad Murray. This song once again features a load of session musicians, but once again Brian and Carl Wilson are there on the instrumental track. They had better luck in early 1970 with their Al Jardine-led cover version of Leadbelly's Cottonfields, which had also been recently covered by Creedence Clearwater Revival. This top 5 hit in the UK and in Europe featured the band and their live backing musicians in a nearly live recording session where they were augmented by legendary steel guitarist Red Rhodes. As a band that had made their reputation for their sterling studio work, Cottonfields is a unique example of the Beach Boys taking their increasingly muscular live sound into the recording realm, in this case deriving much power from Dennis Wilson's presence behind the drum kit. After this, we have a 6-year dry spell between top 30 hit singles in the US and UK, and it's worth mentioning briefly that during this period, the band usually didn't track together as a group, but each member would contribute individually to the instrumental tracking on songs that they wrote, co-produced, and occasionally as session players for the other members of the band. Carl Wilson figured most heavily in the tracking for this period, along with erstwhile Beach Boys Blondie Chaplin, Ricky Fataar, Bruce Johnston, until his hiatus from the band in 1972, members of the Beach Boys touring band, most notably Daryl Dragon, later the captain of the Captain and Tennille, his brother Dennis, later of the Surf Punks, and guitarist bassist Ed Carter, and occasionally Brian, Dennis, Al, and some of the old hands from the Wrecking Crew. This brings us up to 1976's 15 Big Ones and Brian Wilson's comeback as producer. The first single, Rock and Roll Music, was a worldwide hit, and unusually it features Brian and Dennis, but not Carl. along with a number of outside players from the Beach Boys stage band and the old session crew. The follow-up, It's Okay, features Brian, Carl, Dennis, and former drummer Ricky Guitar, along with members of Roy Wood's band Wizard adding horns. So this is mostly the band. The group's next top 30 hit was Al Jardine's composition with a little help from Johann Sebastian Bach, Lady Lynda. This was a top 10 hit in the UK and also did decently on the AC charts in the US. Al Jardine is the only Beach Boy playing on it, although Dennis Wilson helped with the string arrangement. The band's next big hit was in 1981 when the Beach Boys medley made number 12. Later that year, the band's label cobbled together a compilation of their 70s work and released a song from 1978's MIU album, a cover of the Del Vikings' Come Go With Me, as a single, and it unexpectedly made the top 20 in the US. Unusually, Al Jardine is responsible for most of the instrumentation on this track, along with Dennis Wilson on overdubbed drums and some session players on horns. It would be 4 more years before the band scored another top 30 hit, and unfortunately during that period, drummer Dennis Wilson passed away at the age of 39 from drowning. Next up is the band's 1985 comeback hit, Getcha Back, and although the band went to a good deal of trouble, including sampling a drum kit in a tennis court to capture Dennis Wilson's slamming snare sound, besides that ghostly tribute, no Beach Boys appear instrumentally on this track. The Beach Boys' hit collaboration with rap group The Fat Boys likewise has no instrumental work from the band, and oddly seems to have very little vocal work by the band, with Brian Wilson seemingly overdubbing himself on the background harmonies and one cameo appearance by Mike Love. Likewise, 1988 smash hit Kokomo, no Beach Boys, albeit longtime touring guitarist Jeff Foskett does play acoustic guitar. And before we wrap it up, we should mention that the band scored 2 top 30 holiday hits back in the 60s, Little Saint Nick and The Man with All the Toys, and on these the band is providing its own instrumental accompaniment with a little help on Little Saint Nick from their dad, Murray Wilson, on the Celeste. Oh, lest we forget, there was one more top 30 hit in the UK in 1996, the Beach Boys and Status Quo covering the former band's Fun Fun Fun. Although this rockin' cover version featured new lyrics from Mike Love, there were only vocal contributions from the Beach Boys. So, counting the 2 Christmas singles, the Beach Boys made 41 visits to the top 30 in the US and the UK throughout the years. Of those 41 hit singles, 4 or more members of the band played on 22 of them, more than half. The number of those singles with no instrumental contribution whatsoever from the band, only 8. And that includes their collaboration with Status Quo, which is a totally functioning band of its own. So, while it is accurate to say that the Beach Boys got substantial help from session musicians over the years, particularly on their most groundbreaking work, asserting that the Beach Boys rarely, if ever, played on their own records is categorically wrong. Far more often than not, they did. So if you are a Beach Boys fanatic and you like to get as deep into the weeds as I do, why not subscribe to this channel and check out my show, Pat Squares, A Geek's Guide to the Beach Boys, where we get very, very far down the rabbit hole into analyzing the band's music, who played what, all that good stuff. So just click on the Karma Frog logo on the right of your screen, and if you do that, you'll be seeing me soon enough. I've been your host, Adam Marsland. Thanks for watching this video.